If you've been following my content since I started this channel, most of my content has been focused around modern policy, what's going on in the world, a lot of current affairs. And the main reason for that is because of how tense and fiery politics has been in the last few months. However, I want to bring back an aspect of the idea that I had with starting Statecraft was I wanted to also include philosophy because something that a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the things that we're thinking about right now has been taught in the past. There's a lot of writing about it because most of humanity's problems are repetitive. Of course, there's going to be different factors. I'm not saying that they were dealing with carbon emissions back in 300 BC, but the idea was still there. They still had to answer certain questions about trade-offs, for example. That's how the first economic theories came into play. So I committed to college roughly a month or two ago, and since then, I've been spending a lot of my time reading philosophy, and the reason is I want to understand why or how we justify things. And it's not just political philosophy, so I'd like to flip-flop between political and mental philosophies. I will be starting a series called Philosophy Friday, where we kind of slow down, just like how philosophy is a lot slower than modern politics. We're going to slow down and look at the deeper ideas that play a part in the way we think about what's going on in the modern world. So, the question I want to start with today is what makes a good citizen? What makes a proper citizen? I'm talking in the context of a democratic Western society. So, when people talk about citizenship today, they usually talk about things like rights. So, they get freedom of speech, they get voting rights, civil liberties. And while those things are incredibly important, philosophers have always asked about the other side of the questions. If citizens get rights, what else do they give back? What are their responsibilities? The Lord Krishna says this in the Bhagavad Gita, which I've been reading recently, and there's many different people that have said this in the past, is one that takes but doesn't give, that's a thief. That's a thief. When society gives a bunch of things to someone and they're not giving anything back to society, that's a thief. They're being a thief. If civilians and citizens are supposed to have those responsibilities, what kind of responsibilities does a citizen have in a democratic society like the ones that exist today? So when we go back to some of the most early philosophers that talked about this, we think of Aristotle, who actually believed that a good citizen is not just someone who lived in a state, it's someone that's very capable of participating in it. So that meant understanding what the laws are, thinking critically, and being able to deliberate about public life, public service, and about society as a whole. So in other words, it wasn't just citizenship, wasn't just a legal status, it was a skill. It was a skill that a good citizen should adopt. Additionally, it's my belief that in the modern sense that the founding fathers had the idea that education would be creating functioning members of society that would also be able to undertake their civic duties, aka voting, with proper education, proper facts, proper ideals, and with a clear mind. So that's where it kind of plays into the modern day. And it's one of the things I'm most passionate about is I don't think the education system or the educational institutions we have in this country have equipped teachers enough to really create functioning members of society that are able to properly exercise their civic rights. We don't really talk too much about the different schools of thought. In school, we kind of cover those things briefly. And while I do understand that knowledge or material knowledge is important, knowing facts, knowing dates, knowing formulas, I don't think that that itself can really preserve a democracy because democracy requires thoughtful citizens, and that all begins in childhood. And education can't just be about memorizing these informations and passing tests. It has to prepare people to critically think on the big stage because voting is a serious thing. It affects everyone. Whoever wins, that affects everyone. Policy affects everyone. So citizens need to be able to evaluate arguments, think critically about society, and engage in public life, and that all starts early on. So the health of democracy might depend less on the politicians themselves and more on whether citizens are educated enough to question them. I think that as a society, if we have better education standards, then we can root out some of these rotten politicians that exist in office because people are more educated and they know not to vote for them. a lot of the polarization we see today isn't just about disagreements, it's about whether people actually have the tools to evaluate themselves, understand policy, and engage respectfully with opposing views. That's been very, very, very rough in the past few years. The strong polarization of the different political angles in this country. And it all starts in education, having good conversations, critically thinking, challenging people to question their own thought process. So when we ask what makes a good citizen, we're really asking something deeper. We are kind of asking what kind of education produces a good citizen. That's kind of my take on that. That's what I think the most important aspect of it is, because democracy doesn't just run on the institutions itself. It's also the citizens that vote for who takes power in these institutions. And if we want better politics, we might need to start thinking more seriously about what kind of citizens we're educating. That's the first episode of Philosophy Friday. I'll see you next week.